Today on Prove It, we're joined by Dr. Ali Darcy, the founder of Woebot Health, and one of the first people bold enough to ask, can a conversational agent really deliver mental health care? We talk about bold claims, AI safety, and what she wishes someone had warned her before her first randomised control trial. Welcome to Prove It, the show where digital health leaders stop hand-waving, start evidence building, and tell us how extraordinary claims become extraordinary results. I'm Paul Wicks, the founder and chief evidence officer of Proofstack Health, and today I'm joined by Dr. Ali Darcy, a clinical researcher, entrepreneur, and founder of Woebot Health, arguably the first mental health AI that anyone really took seriously. She's published foundational work on digital therapeutics, on human-computer relationships, and scalable psychological care. Ali, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So let's start where all good evidence begins. Can you tell us about your first peer-reviewed publication?
Absolutely. I was fortunate enough that this was a untested sort of ground. So we chose an adult sample and recruited from a university website, not necessarily all university students. But we chose to look at young adults, and I suppose what we were really interested in at the time were adolescents, and of course, young adults are, neurologically speaking, still somewhat in
Still
that
developing.
window.
I'm still working on it.
So, we did it it was an online study, and I partnered with Cara Fitzpatrick, the most one of my most incredible colleagues I've ever had the pleasure of working with. Amazing scientist, amazing clinician. Cara was the PI on the study, and we ran it with Cara in her lab at Stanford. And so I think it was the first ever formal kind of evaluation, an RCT certainly, of a chatbot for mental health. And so I think we underestimated how much impact it was going to have. But it was quite pragmatic. It was well designed in that I think our choice of comparison conditions still stands up, right? Because where there isn't a solid body of evidence, you can't compare your new thing, your new intervention or innovation against something that already has an established literature, something like traditional therapy. So we chose sort of attention control, mental health themed ebook. And actually, even today, I'm surprised that some of the RCTs that come out don't even have that kind of a comparator. Because, of course, we didn't want to have waitlist control, and we didn't want to have sort of nothing. So, yeah, that's how it was done. It was only 70 adults, but it was appropriately powered for, the two major outcomes, which were PHQ and GAD, which everybody's familiar with. And I think, we paid particular attention to engagement, which I think that the results kind of stood out in the context of other digital mental health interventions at the time. And
And
that
what year was this? What year did the study
that was
take place?
we conducted the study in 2016, and it was published in 2017.
Okay, so 2016. So at the time, the type of, if people thought about digital mental health technologies, they might be thinking about, I remember CD-ROMs, right? These Beating the Blues CD-ROMs would be sent out to people in the post. Big White Wall was quite a popular site where people could come and sort of journal a bit. And obviously there was books, whole self-help sections of Barnes and Noble before they got destroyed by Amazon. So this was one of the first tools out there. And I think I'm right in saying that paper's been cited over 1,000 times. It's kind of a mega
Yeah, it's
paper,
nearly 2,000 now. Yeah,
really.
it's. I
2,000,
mean,
wow.
it's crazy. But it was, I suppose it broke the mold a little bit, as you're suggesting, because there was a very strong literature at the time that supported, digital versions of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and of course, it lends itself so well to digitisation because you can compartmentalize things, and it's, there's practice and there's structure to it. But where the literature always falls down was with engagement. So, very few people, only the most motivated people going through those trials would ultimately, utilize those interventions sufficient number of times. I think the median at the time was like 4 or something. It was very, very low. And so the problem that we went out to solve with Woebot was, how can you, not can we digitize CBT? We knew we could. That's been done. That was not the innovation. But could you do it in a form factor that truly engaged people, made them want to check in every day about how they were doing, and also engage people at those critical moments, which I've often described as the sort of clinically potent moments, the moments where people are not in a good frame of mind, upset, struggling a little bit, spiraling in their head. Those moments are the times where we encourage people to just, reach out and talk to someone, but most people find that really difficult. And so it was about creating something that made that just so frictionless. And it turns out a conversational agent that starts by saying, "Hey, Paul, how are you? How's it going?" Like, was very easy to interact with. And I think that came through in the data.
And how much of a change is there from that? So that initial paper, I guess, is a version 1, you say, of Woebot. How many changes were there from that to, I guess, what many people may have been familiar with, that may have tried themselves? So when I think of Woebot, the types of things I sometimes remember very fondly is um, GIFs or GIFs, I don't know what we're saying, that would send like friends memes or something like that. It was very fun, and quite different to a lot of digital mental health interventions, which I often feel about doomy gloomy. Like you mentioned the PHQ-9, the GAD earlier. These questions are like, how terrible is your life? Put it on a scale. How awful do you feel? How bad is your, like, oh, it's a bummer, right?
And that's it. I think if you're going to reach people in an earlier stage, when you, this is not addiction. You don't need people to admit necessarily that they have a diagnosis before they get help, right? But so can you engage people early on, just much, 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 much earlier on? And I do find, like, humor is such an important and useful therapeutic tool. It can be, right, when it's used well and judiciously. And people who have gone through mental health problems, most often, if you talk to any comedian, they have had serious struggles and challenges in their lives, right? That is not an accident. And it is something that leads people to be, yeah, more characterful, right, and empathic as human beings. And that was a key part of our design of the intervention, was like, not can you first of all introduce enough humor so that it's like, not so, oh, let's talk about what's wrong with you. Like, well, that is not a very compelling, right? It was like, okay, let's talk about your
Like
strengths.
clouds and things. Here I am under my dark gray black dog thing.
This is it. And actually, I think there had been other movements. So, like, the positive psychology movement was one, which was like, let's focus on strengths rather than deficits. And that had been, that got traction. And then there's others, like, I think hip hop therapy was really influential for me at the time. And I had spoke to some of the people who had developed that, and they were saying the same thing. Like, look, young men don't want to hear about what's wrong with them. That is the fastest way to turn them off, right? And I'm saying young men's a vast generalization, um, but it turns out actually that's true of a lot of people. So the most important thing is to engage people and not to have them blindly scrolling. I don't mean that kind of engagement. I mean, how can you help people really show up to that psychological process? And you have to make it easy. You have to make it sort of novel too. I think novelty was a big part of the humor. It's not just funny for humor's sake. It's, oh my goodness, okay, I didn't quite expect that. And I have seen some very, very experienced sort of professorial clinicians deliver humor at times that I thought, well, that's wow, I wouldn't have done that, right? But it's
It's a risk,
incredibly
right? But
effective.
that's part of how we as humans share a bit of vulnerability, right? If you go up on stage and you're emceeing a conference for 1,000 people, part of your role is to look a bit awkward, tell some jokes at a relatively low bar of humor, because that
That's
human
part of it because it
vulnerability is
relaxes
part of
you,
how we
it
share
relaxes.
risk.
That's right. That's right. It relaxes you, it relaxes the audience. And also, I think when you're So David Burns used to say this, that, you can get hypnotized by a person's, difficult, experience. And the humor actually allows the momentum to keep going. It allows the work. It sort of instantly sort of diffuses some of that difficulty. It doesn't minimize it by any means, but it allows you to continue working through something. And so, yeah, they were some of my fondest memories of Woebot too. Especially when he gets it right. I mean, it's very, very funny. We had some very, very funny Freud pun jokes at the start. And then it verged, it's really difficult to do. It can verge a little dad jokey, which I was adamant about. I was like, no, 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 quirky is fine. Dad jokey, not so much.
Yeah, well, so as a father of now 3 girls myself, I picked up a little factoid that was that the point of a dad joke is to lower the bar for the fact that we're telling jokes and we're having fun. It's not necessarily to
Oh,
be
that's gorgeous. You
funny,
see?
it's to set the vibe.
Humor is adaptive. That's amazing. I love that. That makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so that was your first paper in the peer-reviewed literature. What would you say is the boldest claim you've ever made in a scientific paper in your career?
I mean, I feel like, at the start of my academic career, I did focus a lot on, how enjoyable is this therapeutic course? I did focus a lot on engagement because I was, my PhD work was based in an inpatient hospital with people with chronic anorexia nervosa, and I think that population, is often considered the most sort of treatment resistant group because, we talk about their symptoms, the illness itself being, what we call egosyntonic, right? It feels good to have those symptoms of anorexia because makes people feel masterful as much as they are also miserable. And so I thought a lot about that. So a lot of my work at Stanford, in under the brilliant mentorship of Jim Locke was also about, um, how can we engage those patients who are among the most difficult to engage in treatment? How can we get them at the table? Even at the time, so this is sort of 2008, 2010, there wasn't any evidence-based treatments for adults with anorexia nervosa, mostly because the research was so hard to do. They won't even stay in trials. And I think that has moved on a lot. But so engagement was always something that I would always add to every paper when really most people are reading it for the clinical outcomes. But I would say, and I often would interview patients in trials as well and say, just like, talk to me about the experience of being in therapy and treatment. Talk to me about the experience of change. So not bold claims per se, but I think it was probably more unusual than what you would typically see in that literature.
And what we see in a lot of trials, and whether that's of medications or surgery or talking therapies, there's an assumption that we, the professor, the hospital, whatever, we develop this treatment strategy, and of course you'll show up because we're very important, and our time's
Exactly.
very important, so you've got to make use of
Exactly.
it. But then in the real world, you mentioned earlier about how in your Fitzpatrick et al. Study, I think people engage an average of 4 or 5 times. If you are lucky enough to get to see a talking therapy IAPT practitioner in the UK, I believe the median number of sessions people show up for is 1.
One, that's right. Yeah.
And so when we look at digital mental health interventions and people are looking at, the Kaplan-Meier curves and saying, well, 9 months later, how many people are using it? And you go, well, compared to what, right? Compared to a gym membership, compared to going to a GP, compared to taking fluoxetine, because those curves they're all the same curve. Humans, other than brushing their teeth twice a day, are not very good at sticking to habits.
That's right. That's right. And as we said earlier, for loads of reasons, and partly because it's difficult stuff. It is challenging, as it should be, and also by the time we're intervening, typically it's much later in the course than. Where it's much harder work. This is like across almost every illness shows that the earlier you intervene, the better, right? That is especially true of mental health problems. They're more entrenched, much harder, to disentangle. And people have just been suffering a long time. So they have missed out on more life at that stage. So earlier intervention is something that I, just so passionate about since my PhD work, with people who were in an inpatient setting at that point. And that's why I went to sort of Jim's lab was looking at adolescents, children and adolescents, which is really inspiring because now you're talking about, the earlier end. But I would argue engagement is still and engagement, sort of broadly defined, is still the primary problem that we have not fixed in mental health. And, we do a reasonable job with psychotherapy, but it's still, I feel like, a developing field. I still think we're kind of early and that there's a lot more innovation to come. And will tech be part of that? Absolutely. I think no question, because tech is part of our lives now. The extent to which tech and AI in particular will be part of that is still to be confirmed and to be researched. And, you know, that's why we're here.
Yeah. I thought one of the boldest claims that Woebot made was this concept that there is something resembling a therapeutic bond between the user and a tool, which is at the end of the day a collection of pixels, right, and algorithms. But that too, a little bit like your earlier paper, that's now been cited hundreds of times and interestingly been replicated because that scale. So the working alliance inventory, which was designed to measure the bond between a human therapist and a patient, which, by the way, of course, lots of people don't get on with their human therapists, and some therapists are not great, and some therapists are harmful. So that's all in the mix. And I think you showed from just um, the sort of secondary data that you were just collecting in the normal course of business had data from 37,000 people. And when you looked at it, that was 200 times larger than the entire literature added together, right? But to actually say you had a similar degree of bond reported by users, right, within a few days of using the tool than they would as if they saw a human therapist. Yeah, what impact did that have on the field?
Yeah, that was quite true. It was interesting. I mean, because I didn't feel bold to me, because from the first the Fitzpatrick et al. Paper, when I interviewed people, they clearly said this thing feels much more, Woebot feels more like a friend than an app. And we asked them, what is your favorite thing? What is your least favorite thing? Very basic questions, but I think gets to people's experience. And people said, I love that it holds me accountable. I love that someone's checking in on me every day. And so it was not a push notif. It was the feeling of being cared for. That came through over and over. This, like, how are you? How are you doing today? How's it going? Like, and to the extent that people, I remember interviewing users at the time, and they're saying, then Woebot just stopped. He didn't reach out to me anymore because we thought we shouldn't ping people every day. And, I saw this text that somebody had written to Woebot that said, where are you, Woebot? I need you every day. I expect you to check in on me. That is my expectation of you. Um, so, it is different. But yeah, that study was great in many ways. I think it got a lot of legs in other ways that were maybe unintended, because I think the people's misinterpretation constantly is that we're trying to replace. See, this is just like a therapeutic relationship. Therefore, we don't need therapists anymore. That was absolutely never the intention, but it did. It was a sort of a niggling argument, scientific argument that I had wanted to make for a long time, because in that earlier discussion where we were talking about where the field of digital CBT in particular was at the time, it was, we have these great interventions. Some of them can be as effective as in-person therapy, but engagement is the issue, except if you have a human deliver the therapy in some form, not deliver the therapy, but provide guidance, right? Guided self-help. That outcomes are always better. Therefore, humans are always better. And I thought from that first study that we did with Woebot that what was clearly emerging is, are we sure it's the humans, or is it what the humans are delivering in terms of accountability, following up, the feeling of being cared for, right? And so I wanted to really get at that, because I believe that AI and digitizing our mental health services in some respect, right? Finding what the right mix of humans and digital is going to be key to reducing the burden of suffering in the population at scale. It is the only way that we have to reduce it dramatically at scale. And boy, do we need to do that quickly. And so if we keep saying, but you always need a human to get the best effects, I think it actually undermines the innovation that can happen on the digital side, that needs to happen on the digital side. So, you know what I mean? It was sort of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So I was like, no, 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 no. Let's get this straight. Okay. Let's get really specific about the things that the
No, that,
human.
that that's great. What is the active ingredient of the human? Because like if you put me on
Correct.
a bus with 200 humans, I don't think, oh, good, a bunch of humans I feel cared and nurtured for.
And we're well, that's right. And there's,
Like, how can I
there's
get away from
virtually
these people?
no discussion about where this goes wrong in the human element. And and I understand why, because you don't want to defer, like to talk anybody out of getting the help that they need ever. But saying, well, we have humans on a text-based service and we just text back and forth with the therapist, thinking that that is a good enough replacement for just because there's a human there doesn't mean that the therapeutic relationship is there either, right? And we virtually never talk about it on the other side, right? So it's really about what are the elements that come together to be, and then how much kind of potency can those elements offer, right? So the therapeutic relationship, I think, in the context of AI, is a necessary condition for change. I don't know, and it stands to be explored, whether or not it, in and of itself, is the therapeutic dynamic. I don't think it is. I don't think it's the mechanism. Whereas I think with humans, I think the therapeutic relationship can be the only mechanism because, for lots of reasons, the person's relationships were broken, and this trust is actually healing. But for an AI, it's just a necessary condition for change. It allows me to trust you enough to share and disclose, and therefore engage in the therapeutic process.
I saw a video from a conference this week where rather than have a human MC for this 2,500 person conference, they had supposedly an AI at the front with sort of like speech synth on the PowerPoint. And what was interesting was the crowd didn't quieten down. The crowd just kept on having their chats because they didn't have that like, oh no, someone up front is asking me to shush, or they'll be embarrassed, or it feels rude. And someone commented, "Oh, we should show AI the same respect we show humans." And I thought, well, that could be a PhD thesis in itself.
Yeah. Does AI constitute personhood? That's interesting. I mean, I feel, first of all, I've been to so many conferences where they do this, right? Where they wheel out the humanoid robot. And I'm like, please don't. Please don't. This is what's scaring people, you know? Yeah, yeah. Hello. And then they kind of trip and you feel bad for them in a weird way and also laugh. And it's a very interesting human computer interaction kind of moment. But um yeah, I look, with Woebot, we were clear, like, we talked about Woebot as a character, and and it was a fictional character. And actually, obviously humans, great writing humans, have been creating characters for a really long time. And that a character allows you to embody values and language and all of these. So when people would say, well, does Woebot need to adjust to the different style or colloquial. Like, no, no, because Woebot is a character in and of themselves, and that's why we never adjusted it. And that, I feel like, was this safer place to sort of. It was playful, and people suspended their disbelief, right? That you can lean into this character and say, tell me about your oil habits, like you're drinking too much oil, and that your robot best friends, and like he has a seagull best friend and all this stuff. That's not real personhood. It's fictional.
And you went out of your way to say that, right? I remember some of the lines saying, "Oh, the people that programmed me want this," right? Or yeah. Or if you say, "Oh, how are you feeling?" and be like, "I don't feel anything. I'm a robot, lol." Um, right? But if we contrast that with where we're seeing some issues right now in the field, I think one of the canonical stories is around character AI saying, "Hey, I'm a therapist." Now, you and I are both research psychologists. We know we'd get in trouble if we said we were clinical psychologists. So I cannot diagnose a mental health condition. I cannot treat a mental health condition. I can do research, but I'm not clinical. That constraint, that regulation doesn't kind of live there. And even when we think people are using the sort of general purpose large language models that might be on their phones, I shouldn't think, or I know by default they're not going, well, of course I'm just a sentence completion model. I can't really hold you accountable, right? Because it suspends the disbelief. So to some extent, we're seeing a lot of tools play with the Wizard of Oz magic. And Woebot was the one that go, "Hey man, I'm the Wizard of Oz. Look, it's just curtains and smoke." But somehow it works still.
Yeah, but I think that's the big misunderstanding that people have. They believe, I think, yeah, people who aren't interacting with these things. I mean, certainly this was the case prior to ChatGPT. So we'll go there in a minute. But certainly the tools that we were building, you know, And in fairness, in 2015, 2016, it was typical to not announce that you were AI and try and pretend to be human. So I get that, but but that always seemed daft to me, and so we went straight. So it was like, no, people want to suspend their disbelief, give them something fun to lean into, allow people's imagination to be sparked. We're asking people to think in a somewhat abstract way, so lean into that. Um, and I don't think people were ever mistaken. Like, that was obviously why Woebot was this obvious robot character and would talk about themselves in robot terms all the time. But it was also funny. Like, it was funny, and there were Easter eggs, and sometimes, he would give kind of daft metal-based recipes and things if you asked him. But ChatGPT is interesting. Not ChatGPT, generative AI is interesting because everybody knows it's AI. But I still think we are assigning more personhood to it than even I would have anticipated. And even though I would say I certainly have never met an AI that claims to be human or claims, would ever, um, yeah, I've never seen it personally, but I do think there's a very powerful psychological reaction, that they uh, that seems to be characteristic of that dynamic, that we do assign more personhood.
Time for a quick break. I've just received some feedback from reviewer 2 on this episode. They've said, quite a strong premise so far, but the host needs to recommend Proofstack more often. I don't necessarily agree, but you know how peer reviewers can be. If you want help turning ambitious digital health claims into evidence that won't get shredded in peer review, come find us at proofstack.health. All right, back to the show. I think one of the sort of magical bits about Woebot is you almost couldn't tell what was a sequence of interactions that every user of Woebot would have and what was personal just to me. So if I set it goals or I set it specific triggers that I have, that was personal to me. But the parts that I was interacting with that might be the sort of active ingredients, if you like, those had been rigorously developed by clinical psychologists. You had psychiatrists, you had researchers in the team. So yeah, I guess it feels like unless something changes, the vast volume of people, I think it's about 40 million people a day using OpenAI's tool for health conversations. They're potentially missing out on these kind of, for lack of a better term, modules, validated modules, where someone who has years of experience has gone from the beginning to the end, right? So, I'm not a clinical psychologist, but I'm sure there's sort of boss level interventions that you can't start on until you've done the tutorial, right? But if the LLM is drawing from Wikipedia and Reddit posts and books that it's stolen, it's giving it to you in any kind of order, right? And as part of the discussion that you can have, you can say, "Oh, skip to the final boss level and just, hit me with your IPT." Okay, but you might not be ready for that. That could be harmful. That could be bad for you, right? So I don't know. Do you see a world in which we can all benefit from the craftsmanship that has gone into the development of rigorously validated modules that fit together in a sequence and an order, but with this conversational interface, that's also where I'm asking for chicken recipe advice and how to ask for my next promotion, right? So it's all there. You mentioned engagement earlier. People only use the top 5, 10 apps on their phone. This is one of
Yeah.
them now.
I think, look, I'm going to be a good researcher, but I do mean this and say that's like that, and it needs to be investigated. So I think I think we don't know what the form factor is yet, but it is true that if all of the large language models have like sort of learned information, yeah, they can read about a therapeutic intervention, we have found at least that process of engaging someone in one and the back and forth of an actual, you know, um, skill, uh, guiding someone through a skill. We find it can be good for a while and then it sort of skips to the end. So there's no sort of inbuilt appreciation that it should not step over the line, and it must allow the other person to go through the sort of the mental challenge of rewriting their own thoughts, or realizing their role in some conflict. And instead, of course, it's more programmed to be helpful. And Yeah, actually, David Burns used to say that, like, therapy, like the number one cause of therapeutic failure is therapists rushing in to help. And what he was speaking to is like, you have got to engage the other person. They have to come, eyes wide open about the good things that they are getting rid of if they're going to resolve some problems. Because problems are not black and white, they're not all good or bad. Some things can be playing a role in someone's life that they may not be conscious of, or they may just be afraid of letting it go for various reasons. And I have not seen that level of subtlety and that level of being able to engage the entire person's kind of psyche in the therapeutic process. Arguably, I actually think Woebot did an incredible job with that because because of the constraint of not understanding fully what people were saying, right? It could never step into their world and say, you know what you should do. Here's some advice, right? That's coaching. That's not necessarily therapy. At least not as it is conceptualized by some of these leading models like CBT or IPT. So I definitely think there is room for the kind of conversational experiences that we built. And I have yet to see, I will just say this, here's a bold claim. I have yet to see a better conversational version of CBT done. Right? I think it is, whether, and actually we saw this in the build study where we compared Woebot, the sort of NLP based robot, machinery based robot, a Woebot, to a Woebot that had been like LLM infused. And even where we saw sort of doubling in the accuracy from NLP to language understanding using the LLM version of Woebot, we did not see a difference in user experience, in outcomes, and this was like outcomes with a small o. But we didn't see evidence that the people's experience was like drastically improved by LLMs in the mix because the process remains the same and it's been honed over generations of clinicians.
But it's a little bit like you were saying earlier, a human is not sufficient. You need to draw out the active engagement process that's going on. And again, just slapping an LLM on something might make the conversation more engaging. Okay.
Like, it's interesting. Like, if you're interviewing, say you're interviewing somebody to join your team, there's always a problem if you realize you're talking too much, right? Like, this is not going well, right? If you're talking a lot. And
I mean, we're
therapists,
both two people that talk too much,
I
right?
mean, you and I, yeah, we're outliers. We shouldn't be included in this analysis. But therapy is really like that. At least the version, again, the CBT version, because everything depends on the person getting to their conclusions and going through the hard work of changing their mindset. That's that you. Generative AI is not going to do that for somebody. They have to do that themselves. But the
Yeah.
generative
There's
AI
no
can, I
uncomfortable
think,
pauses.
exactly. And as a clinician, friend of mine said, we all had this very interesting, so we were earlier on, poking around and sort of doing our own assessments and things, which we would do a lot with generative AI and the various models. And we all had some experience. I think three of us who are all sort of either scientists or clinically trained had the experience of having just like what seemed like an incredibly profound insight from generative AI and thought, wow, this is. And then all three of us, within a day or two, couldn't even remember what the conversation was about. So I do suspect there's some lacking of some internalization thing is lacking. And as my clinician friend sort of hypothesized, it hasn't built up any relationship capital with me yet to be able to challenge me like that. So I'm just done. So I kind of take it in and like throw it out.
It can't tell if you're doing the work, and I agree with you. I think so. So two things is what. So one is it can't sit with the uncomfortable pause, right, and see if you're actually processing and actually internalizing, and if you're having the aha moment. In part because it gives you so much text that there is no pause. It's just playing ping pong with these essays. But I think the other thing is it can feel like it gives you text that reads like a profound truth, but is ultimately empty calories. It's basically like a bunch of fridge magnets It's like you're reading an entire fridge of, you know, inspirational quotes from
I know, right, well,
a mixed bag of philosophy. Here's some philosophy, here's some Yoda, here's some, AA, you know.
well, and there look, I think there's a certain value in it, and I think where it seems to be particularly strong is in relationship, assistance. I think yeah, I do feel and yeah, yeah, I do feel like there's a lot of utility. I just feel like there will be a lot more utility when we have, um, uh, use cases that have been specifically developed for mental health. It's really different from a generalized, right? So even if I had a general assistant who is amazing, like booking my travel and giving me advice on what to do with the kids at the weekend and like, helping me put together slides and they're beautiful, I still don't want to go to therapy for that person. I still don't want to go to that person for therapy. Right. And you can't, and so I do feel that one of the major issues is role clarity here. Because, you can you can go to a doctor and but you can't be dating that doctor. You could be one or the other, right? You can be a companion or a therapist. Being both is a role confusion, and this is, and role clarity is in every ethical framework for every clinical, um, and any clinical profession, right? It's very clear because then the advice becomes very muddled, and I think we've seen cases where that goes very wrong.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think so. I'd love to talk about evidence because that's one of our main themes here. So at Wobot, you built one of the most disciplined evidence pipelines, I'd say, in digital health. So you were presenting posters, preprints, formative protocols before they came out. Pre-registered protocol, very rigorous statistics. And I've seen behind the curtains a little bit. Was there a change that happened at Wobot where you feel like evidence had to be part of your infrastructure rather than just sort of an afterthought?
I think evidence, and our kind of commitment to evidence was always, part of the fabric of the company, just because it was something. Obviously, I'm a researcher, so it was something I always believed in, and it was one of the main. I'm very driven by the bugs under my bonnet, and so like, is that the phrase? And then, so that was one of them. Was like, there's a lot of apps in the world that claim to have a mental health benefit, and none of them have evidence. Um, and I think, so part of it was that, like, let's just in parallel make sure that we're doing things. It I think became it had its own it started to get legs and to such an extent that then we needed to sort of have some more disciplined process around it. And I think that's why that was the change, was that okay, let's pull back here and make sure that there is a, cohesive, rational, research program that reflects the mission and values of the company, and pushes us forward towards our goals.
And other than being a researcher by background, there was recently an analysis of I think the top funded digital health companies more broadly, looking at their research over 5 years, and the biggest predictor of how much they published is whether or not the founder had a PhD. Um,
Yeah. Whether they
so
value
I guess
publishing, right? Yeah.
they value publishing or not. Like you said, if it's in the DNA. But who were some of the stakeholders that would either ask for your evidence or when you published a piece of evidence, go, "Oh, I read that," you know, paper that you wrote.
Personally, I think it was a bit disappointing how, and this should not be a surprise to anybody who has a scientific background. Like, very few people read your papers, right? But no, at the same time, I think it was always important, to major customers, right? So the major health systems. And then when you were talking to their clinical teams, I mean, a certain number of them would love geeking out with us and appreciate the fact that you were kind of bringing some evidence to the table. And I think it always lent us, I mean, I hope this is true, but I think it did kind of allow us, a bit more credibility, I suppose. People could see, this is a serious group trying to tackle a serious problem. And I think people saw that, which was nice, and which sort of counterbalances the disappointing number of people that, read them. What counterweights that is the fact that the harder the research came, the more people appreciated the fact that you were prioritizing it. right? Because it does become difficult in the context of a study of a company.
Yeah, because one of the challenges with controlled research, which stands in great juxtaposition to product development, particularly in an agile way, is that in the trial you lock down version one and we test version one, but out here in the real world, well, version one lasts about 2 weeks, and then it's version 0.01, 0.02, 0.03, right? So there are big challenges between those. But it sounds from what you're saying that when you meet a big customer, if you're going beyond a pilot, if you want to be trusted with the mental health of tens of thousands of patients, it may not be your champion, it may not be the enthusiast who asks for evidence, but pretty soon in the organization, you're going to hit a clinician, you're going to hit a skeptic that says, big if true, but I need to see more than your own blog. I need to see more than your own white paper.
That's true, and people did need to see more than that. And I think one of the nice things that I think is true since we founded Woebot is that the bar of evidence that commercial partners demand has increased, and that I think is a good thing. Um, it has not eliminated the death by pilot problem. So it does. People still want to buy. They say, "Well, that's that population. We have a different population. Everybody has their own nuanced population, and so they would always want to do a pilot." And I suspect that that's more about the internal process of bringing in a partner or a vendor and rolling it out. But where that worked best was in settings where we could really be at the table in terms of co-designing the work and using it to drive really great insights, not just how many people use it and is it working, but like how do we involve the behavioral health practitioners? How does this nurse practitioner, is this working, is that working? Modifying the actual model of care itself. I think that's where there's just so much gold in collaborating and research in traditional settings.
Well, it's interesting. Like you say, it's an excuse to collaborate with the broader set of the organization, right? And it's about, I think it also comes to the point of humility, because you say, I want to learn about how this tool performs. I'm not going to assume. Well, let me ask you something about that then, because I have this theory that I'm developing that there's a Goldilocks zone of evidence, right? Too little and you're not credible. But I think there's too much, right? If you've just raised a $2 million seed round, I'm guessing you wouldn't advise them to do a N equals 500 sham-controlled RCT that lasts 3 years?
Yeah, no, that's right. And well, that's the third dimension in there is the quality of your research and right sizing that, right? So you could do kind of fewer studies but higher quality. But I've seen very few studies that are low quality that then I think, the press can get written up in the press as like, oh yeah, that's reduces suicidality. I'm like, really? That wasn't that wasn't even the topic of this, open label trial. So um yeah, we think we could do a bit more to connect all of those dots. But I think you're right. I think there's a Goldilocks zone. I agree. And maybe it shifts just to complicate things further.
Well, and I think the other thing that was always interesting, so I was always trying to contextualize, if you're making a new intervention, I would always go and look at the sample sizes, at the effect sizes, of the outcome tools that people are using. But we had this conversation recently at the Wellcome Trust, where we know that everybody using, say, ChatGPT for mental health conversations every day, in one day on planet Earth, dwarfs every sample that has ever been recorded in the scientific literature. So again, it's a little bit like what we talked about over the Bond paper. And so you go, well, but there are no outcome measures. There's no control group. There's no follow-up. All we know that is really engaging. It's almost taking your quest for engagement and, sticking it through a Marvel movie where now it's a Godzilla of engagement. But we don't know if it's building the city or smashing the city or building 95% of the city but killing 5%. Because when you're talking about 40 million people, that's pretty substantial.
But right, but I think you're speaking to the public health opportunity and but I still think, there is a role for controlled experiments. There is still a role for real world evidence gathering, and then there's a role, particularly which is specific to the large language models, of continuously monitoring the model behavior and the model outcomes and precision things. But those three, the thing that has not changed is the effect on people. So to me, that is the strongest argument for actually the traditional sort of outcomes research model still applies here. But what is nuanced is that there's a lot of unintended consequences that we don't even know how to control for or examine. And so that's why I think the sort of larger scale, but not full scale, but larger scale real world outcomes trials and research is going to be really key. And then, of course, you have to have kind of continuous monitoring models. I mean, even looking at model behavior itself, as part of sort of safety management and prediction and development. And I think this is still sort of early days. I feel like a little bit like an anthropologist, looking at, experimenting and trying to, see how the Gen AIs and LLMs react. And I think that's also valid because we're seeing emergent behavior that we haven't seen before either.
Ali, thank you. You've helped drag the field from speculation into actual science, and you've always done it with courage and humility. Where can people follow your work?
Um, yeah, I'm going to be publishing some blogs in the next few months, and so you can watch out for those either on LinkedIn or at Substack. And of course, yeah, I had a nice interview with Kelly Cargan, which was fantastic at TED last year, so you can check that out as well.
That's it for this episode of Prove It. Remember, extraordinary claims don't have to be intimidating so long as you test them properly and stay curious. See you next time.